In 2150, humanity learned the Earth's magnetosphere would collapse sometime in the next half-century, eliminating all life on the planet. Decisive action was required, but the secure transport of an entire civilization would demand a new kind of cooperation, a new kind of courage, and a new kind of union.
Somewhere out there, past the edge of charted space, past the trade lanes and the colony ships and the thousand small fires of human ambition, there is a planet you already know. You have never been there. Nobody living has, not in the way it deserves to be seen, and yet the moment you set eyes on it, the gray crust, the crater-pocked silence, the thin, colorless haze where an atmosphere used to be, something in you recognizes it, not from memory, from absence, from the shape of the thing that should be there and isn't, the way you can recognize a face you have never met, because you know the face of their child. Earth is dead. That sentence lands differently depending on how you first encounter it in the settled systems. For some, it arrives early, almost as a footnote, the way an uncomfortable historical fact sometimes gets introduced quietly before the more comfortable parts of history are allowed to begin. Here is where humanity started. Here is what humanity built out among the stars. Oh, and also, the starting point is gone. For others, it arrives as genuine shock, a recalibration of everything. The moment when the scope of all that humanity has constructed out here among these unfamiliar suns reveals the shadow it was constructed inside of. Because that is what nobody quite tells you up front. All of this, every city and faction and ship and law and war and dream that defines the settled systems, was assembled in the aftermath of an ending. Everything humanity built out here was built by people who had already lost the one thing no civilization in recorded history had ever lost before. Their world, not to war, not to plague, not to the slow forgetting of geological time. Earth wasn't conquered by an external force, and it wasn't abandoned in the traditional sense, though the word abandonment does haunt the edges of this history in ways that people in the settled systems tend not to examine too carefully. Earth was killed, and the most important thing about that fact, the one that changes the entire character of the story once you see it clearly, is this. The person most responsible for it knew what he was doing. Not guessed, not suspected, knew. The same engine that opened the stars closed the door behind us, and the man who built that engine had been warned, specifically, unambiguously, by a version of himself from another universe, what it would cost. He built it anyway, and then he helped bury the truth of that choice for as long as he lived. That burial held for almost 2 centuries. That is the tension this story keeps returning to, the thread you pull and find attached to everything. Not the tragedy of loss, though that is real and should not be softened. Not the triumph of survival, though that too is real and hard-won. The tension is in the question of what it means to know the price of something and pay it with someone else's life, the lives of billions of people who were never given the opportunity to weigh in on the transaction. Before we can understand what was lost, we have to understand who decided it was worth losing. And before we can understand that, we have to go back to a civilization standing at the edge of something extraordinary, where one man stood at the edge of a decision that would rewrite the entire future of the human species, and chose. That is the question this all circles around. Was Earth's death a tragedy, or a choice someone made for all of us? Before the answer, there has to be the world. And before the world, there has to be one man standing on Mars. Late Earth is not an easy thing to picture from inside the settled systems, partly because the cultural memory of it was filtered through layers of grief and necessity, and the particular way that civilizations under pressure tend to mythologize what they are losing even as they are in the act of losing it. People do not remember clearly under those conditions. They remember selectively, romantically, with the editing that comes from knowing an ending is coming and wanting the story to be worth the ending. The Earth that survives in the collective memory of the settled systems is partly a real place and partly the thing people needed it to be when they were saying goodbye to it. But the outlines are recoverable if you look carefully enough. By the time the Grav Drive entered the picture, Earth was a civilization of genuinely extraordinary complexity, a species that had split the atom, mapped its own genome, built computational systems of staggering sophistication, and reached out far enough into its own solar system to establish a modest but real presence on other bodies. Cydonia on Mars, research outposts on the moons of the outer planets, the beginnings of a genuine spacefaring civilization still tethered to the gravity well of its home world, but already thinking beyond it, already feeling the particular restlessness that seems to be built into the human relationship with horizons. And yet, for all of that, Earth was also showing its age, not in any single dramatic way. This is important to understand, because the easy narrative is that Earth was already dying before the Grav Drive arrived, that the catastrophe was somehow inevitable. That is not quite right. Earth was a planet under pressure. 3 centuries of industrialization, population growth that had strained every system that supported it, the accumulated cost of the particular model of development humanity had pursued, were all making themselves felt in ways that ranged from the merely uncomfortable to the genuinely alarming. The margins were getting thinner. The room for error was narrowing. The systems that had absorbed human civilization's excesses for centuries were beginning to signal their limits. This matters because it means the Grav Drive arrived not into a comfortable, stable civilization with plenty of time to evaluate new technologies carefully, but into a civilization under enough pressure that a genuine exit door would look like more than just an opportunity. It would look like a solution. The Grav Drive was invented by a theoretical physicist and NASA astronaut named Dr. Victor Aiza. The circumstances of its invention are, themselves, the most extraordinary part of the story. On an expedition to investigate a gravitational anomaly on Mars in 2138, Aiza discovered something, an artifact, one of those strange and ancient objects whose true nature remains contested even now, in 2330. And what happened next is known primarily through a single document he left behind, a personal confession recorded in audio form at the NASA launch tower on Earth before his death, in which he describes the 12 days of lost time that followed his contact with the object. During those 12 days, Aiza says, he was visited by a version of himself from another universe, a self who had lived through everything that followed, a self who understood exactly what the artifact contained and what would happen if the technology reverse-engineered from it were developed and deployed on Earth. That other Aiza taught him the principles behind what would become the Grav Drive, the manipulation of gravitational fields in ways that made interstellar transit possible, and told him, with the specificity of someone who had already lived through the consequences, what pursuing that technology on Earth would cost. The magnetosphere would fail, the atmosphere would strip away, the planet would die. Victor Aiza heard that. He sat with it, and then he built the Grav Drive anyway. The reasoning he offers in his confession is not incoherent, and it deserves to be engaged with honestly rather than dismissed. He believed, genuinely it seems, that the sacrifice of Earth, terrible as it was, would be outweighed by what humanity gained in return: access to other worlds, a future not confined to a single planet, not vulnerable to the single-point failure of a species that had put all of its existence in one place. He believed that the stars were not just an opportunity, but a necessity, a form of existential insurance against the many ways a civilization can end when it has nowhere else to go. He rationalized what he was choosing as a decision for the greater good, made by someone with knowledge that no one else had, in the service of a future that no one else could yet see. That is not a defense, but it is something more complicated than simple villainy, and the complication matters. What followed was the development of the Grav Drive prototype, and then, between 2141 and 2149, its extensive testing, conducted near Luna, humanity's own moon, far enough from Earth to seem safe, close enough to the planet to be catastrophically wrong. The gravity wave spikes produced by those early flawed models radiated outward from the testing site with each use. They reached Earth, and they began, slowly and measurably, to interact with something in the planet's deep interior in ways that no one on the project who didn't already know the truth could have predicted. Aiza knew, and when his colleagues, Dr. Judith Tatien and a researcher named Lan Shu, confirmed what the data was showing, when the correlations between the testing schedule and the fluctuations in field strength became impossible to explain away, the three of them made a decision that would shape everything that followed. The connection was to be concealed. The public was not to know what the Grav Drive was doing to the planet it lived on, in order to prevent a backlash against the technology that was already being positioned as humanity's great leap forward. That concealment held for 2 years. By the time the truth became impossible to suppress in 2150, the damage was irreversible. The magnetosphere is not something most people think about until it is gone. It is the invisible architecture of a planet's habitability. Earth's magnetic field, generated by the convective movement of molten iron in the outer core, extends far out into space. An enormous, dynamic, constantly shifting shield against the solar wind, the constant stream of charged particles that flows outward from the sun at hundreds of kilometers per second. In ordinary conditions, this field deflects the vast majority of that radiation, channeling it harmlessly around the planet, guiding it toward the poles where it produces the auroras that humanity spent millennia watching and wondering at, and protecting the atmospheric column from the stripping effect that unimpeded solar wind would eventually produce. Without that protection, atmosphere bleeds. This is not a hypothetical. The evidence is written in the geological and atmospheric history of the inner solar system. Mars lost its magnetic field billions of years ago. The exact reasons remain debated, but the result is incontrovertible. And in the absence of that protection, the solar wind has spent geological eons stripping away what was once a thicker atmosphere, leaving behind the thin, cold envelope that makes Mars the particular kind of hostile that Sidonia's inhabitants have learned to navigate with full suits and pressurized habitats. The process on Mars played out across billions of years. The gravity wave spikes from the flawed early Grav Drive models tested near Luna did not take billions of years. The precise mechanism, the way gravity waves generated by those tests propagated back toward Earth and interacted with the dynamics of the outer core, belongs to the technical history of a disaster that has never been fully documented, partly because documenting it in detail would have required acknowledging a level of institutional responsibility that no one with the power to authorize documentation had any incentive to accept. What the data collected by NASA's own scientists showed, beginning in the early years of the testing program, was clear enough in its pattern, even if the physics behind it was complex. The magnetometric readings were changing. The field was fluctuating, and the fluctuations corresponded to the testing schedule in ways that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Aiza and his colleagues knew before the public did. That interval between the discovery and the announcement is where one of the most consequential decisions in human history was made, in private, without any external accountability or oversight. The decision to conceal the connection between the Grav Drive testing and the magnetospheric degradation, to allow the program to continue while the public remained unaware of what continued operation was doing to the planet it lived on. What the internal reasoning actually was, we can only piece together from the edges of the record. But based on what we know of how these situations tend to resolve, the inference is difficult to avoid that preventing panic and protecting the integrity of a technology already critical to the evacuation effort were real justifications. The logic is not entirely absurd, but the logic was also convenient for everyone who had invested their careers and their reputations in the Grav Drive program. And that convenience should not be allowed to pass without acknowledgement. By the time the truth could no longer be contained, by the time the accumulating evidence in the magnetometric data had reached a threshold where too many independent researchers were arriving at the same conclusions for suppression to remain viable, 2 years had passed. In 2150, the announcement was made. Earth's magnetosphere was degrading and would fail completely in approximately 50 years. The atmosphere would sputter into space. The planet would become uninhabitable. Humanity had half a century to leave. The public was not told why. The Grav Drive's role in the disaster was not part of the official announcement. The technology that had caused the catastrophe was presented simultaneously as the solution to it, the thing that would carry the colony ships to the worlds humanity would now need to reach. And the framing was accepted partly because the alternative framing was unthinkable, and partly because the people who knew the alternative framing was true had reasons to prevent it from becoming widely known. 50 years. 50 years is a number that seems, on first encounter, long enough to plan, long enough to organize, long enough, perhaps, for the scale of the catastrophe to be somehow absorbed and managed. In certain important ways, that is true. The existence of the settled systems, the fact that humanity survived at all in the numbers it did, is evidence that 50 years was long enough to do something meaningful, to direct the same technological capability that caused the disaster toward the project of surviving it. But 50 years is also a very strange amount of time to live inside of when you know what it means. It is long enough that the initial shock, and the records strongly suggest there was real upheaval in those early years, whatever the official histories prefer to emphasize, could gradually settle into something more like policy, more like administration, more like the grim procedural work of civilizational triage. Long enough that evacuation frameworks could be developed, that priority systems could be argued over and revised and implemented, that the colony ship construction programs that would carry humanity to the stars could be expanded from the experimental scale to the industrial. The United Colonies was formally established in 2159 on Earth, specifically to take charge of the global evacuation effort, an acknowledgement that what was coming was beyond the capacity of any individual nation-state to manage, and that some form of supranational authority was not a luxury, but a necessity. New Atlantis was founded the following year, in 2160, on the planet Jemison in Alpha Centauri, becoming the official capital of the UC in 2161. Long enough, in other words, that by the time the situation was completely clear to everyone, the machinery for responding to it was already in motion. But short enough that the decisions made in the first years of the crisis, when the machinery was still being assembled and the political will to face the full scope of what was needed was still being negotiated, had permanent consequences for which communities were prioritized in the evacuation and which were not. Short enough that the gap between what was possible in theory, an orderly, comprehensive evacuation of billions of people, and what was achieved in practice was enormous, filled with the kinds of decisions that no official framework can quite absorb. Who gets a berth on the next ship, and who waits for the one after, when there may not be a one after? Which populations have the political or economic leverage to ensure their place in the queue, and which do not? Which cultural archives, which repositories of knowledge and art, and the accumulated records of human civilization get loaded and which are left behind because there is no more space and no more time? And short enough that for most of the 50 years, the people living through it were doing exactly that, living through it, not abstractly, not in the policy documents and the political debates that history preserves. In the daily experience of watching the world they had grown up in change around them in ways they had not been told, were connected to a decision made by a man and his colleagues in a laboratory and a conference room years before. The skies looking slightly different as the atmosphere thinned, the weather systems destabilizing at the margins first and then more broadly, the particular quality of the air changing in ways that were not yet dangerous but that registered as wrong, as something that should not be. They knew the planet was dying. They did not know who had decided to let it. And during all of that, running parallel to the grief and the planning and the slow, terrible adjustment to an ending that had been announced but not yet arrived, the colony ships kept being built and kept leaving. The first exploratory expedition reached Alpha Centauri in 2156. New Atlantis was founded on Jemison in 2160 and formally recognized as the UC's capital the following year. The evacuation proper ran from 2149, when the damage became undeniable, until 2199, 4 years before the final collapse, when the last ships departed a planet that was no longer capable of sustaining the people still trying to leave it. In 2203, Earth's magnetosphere failed completely. The atmosphere dissipated. The planet went silent. What does it mean to leave a world behind? Not philosophically, not abstractly, in the specific, bodily, irreducibly concrete sense of carrying what you can and walking away from the rest. The evacuation of Earth was the largest migration in human history, and like most large migrations, it is poorly served by the aggregate figures that tend to be invoked when people discuss it. The numbers are necessary. They establish the scale. They insist on the reality of what happened at a level that the imagination would otherwise domesticate. But they are also, in a sense, the least true part of the story, because what the numbers describe is an event. What they cannot describe is an experience, multiplied across billions of people across decades, each one distinct and particular and shaped by circumstances that no summary can accommodate. What people took with them was the first layer of what could not be adequately preserved. The material losses are real and should be acknowledged. The artworks too large or fragile to be transported, the buildings and monuments and physical sites whose meaning was inseparable from their location, the specific ecosystems of regions that could not be digitized or compressed or shipped. A biosphere is not something you can pack. You can take samples of it, seeds, genetic material, frozen specimens, the careful preservation of what an emergency permits preserving, and the colony ships carried as much of that as they could. But the biosphere of a living planet is not its components. It is the 10,000 interdependencies between those components, the fungal networks and microbial communities and cascading trophic relationships that developed across 4 billion years of evolution into something so complex that the science of understanding it was still very much incomplete when the evacuation began. You cannot archive complexity at that scale. You can only mourn it at whatever remove grief permits and carry the mourning forward. But those losses, as significant as they are, were visible. They were cataloged, at least partially. They could be pointed to. They existed in the record of what was left behind. The losses that did not make the record are the ones that resist that kind of accounting. The ways of being in specific places, the particular routines of particular communities built around specific geographies, specific weathers, specific patterns of light and season, that existed entirely in the lived memory and the habituated bodies of the people who had grown up inside them. The sound of a specific city at a specific hour, the quality of a particular valley in a particular kind of morning, the accumulated sensory grammar of belonging to a place, which is one of the most fundamental forms of human identity, and which cannot be separated from the place itself and transported somewhere else. When the people who held those things in their bodies left, those things ceased to exist anywhere except as the particular quality of absence in the lives of the people who remembered them. The first generation born in the settled systems, the children of the evacuation raised on colony ships, and in the early settlements on worlds that were not yet tamed or even hospitable, grew up with Earth as a story, not as a place, as the story their parents told, with the particular texture that stories have when they are also grief, the thing that shaped everything and could not be returned to, the thing whose importance increased, paradoxically, as the telling of it accumulated layers of loss. These children, this generation, had to do something that neither the generation before them nor any generation since has had to do in quite the same way. They had to build a meaningful life in the full knowledge that the ground it was built on was not the ground they came from, that there was no ground they came from in any sense that felt solid. They had to construct from the materials of their inherited grief and their own fresh experience of worlds that were alien and difficult and not yet fully understood, a relationship to the universe that did not require home in the specific sense, the irreplaceable sense, to be possible. What they built in the aggregate across those first settled systems generations was the cultures and institutions and political dispositions that eventually crystallized into the major factions still present in 2330. The seeds of the United Colonies, the Free Star Collective, the various independents and city-states and loose affiliations that define the map of human space were planted in the soil of that first-generation experience. And those seeds were shaped in ways that have proven both durable and difficult to examine by the specifics of how different communities experienced the evacuation. Who was prioritized, who waited, who made it with time to spare, and who made it only barely, or didn't make it at all. Because not everyone made it off. The historical record on this is fragmentary in ways that have the texture of intention. Not a conspiracy, exactly, more the collective instinct of a civilization that understood early on that a complete and honest accounting of who was left behind and why would be a weight that was very difficult to carry forward into the project of building something new. The names and numbers are not entirely absent from the record, but they are not prominent either. They sit in the margins of the official history, in the footnotes of the evacuation planning documents, in the kind of careful language that does not quite say what it is not quite saying. The weight of it is present in the culture anyway. Unexpressed grief has a way of persisting regardless of how carefully it is managed, working through the system in indirect forms, in the patterns of what people choose to value, in the specific anxieties that drive political decisions, in the shapes of the fears that civilizations build their self-definitions around. If you want to understand what it means to lose a world, the most honest path is to go there. Earth exists in the present of the settled systems. It has not been erased from the map. The planet endures. The mass of it, the orbital track, the cold, silent rock that once cradled the full span of human history. You can plot a course to it. You can descend through what remains of its atmosphere and land on its surface, and walk on the same ground that bore the weight of every civilization humanity ever raised and let fall. The gravity is right. The day length is right. The sun, from that distance, is the same sun, the one that appears in every painting and poem and window that ever existed in the long record of human visual culture. Nothing else is the same. The atmosphere is almost entirely gone. What remains is too thin and too hostile to breathe, too stripped of the chemical balance that once made the interface between sky and ground the specific, complex, life-supporting environment that Earth's biosphere was built inside of. There is no liquid water at the surface. The temperature swings between day and night are brutal, uncushioned by the insulating effect that a full atmospheric column provides. The sky, if you can call it that, has a quality that spacers with experience across many worlds tend to find specifically unsettling. Not the absolute void of an airless moon, but something more like a ghost, a remnant, the optical signature of something that was once there and isn't anymore, making the light at the horizon behave in ways that are almost normal and therefore somehow worse than total absence would be. The surface is marked by ruins, but not in the way you might initially picture. Earth is a large planet, and the civilizations that covered it were enormous in human terms, but modest in planetary terms. What survives at the surface after more than 2 centuries of exposure is fragmentary, the kind of record that rewards patience and specific knowledge of where to look more than it rewards general exploration. What survives tends to be the heaviest and most deeply anchored. Foundations, thick concrete structures built to bear extraordinary loads, the kind of engineering that was overbuilt to begin with. The old space infrastructure is among the most recognizable. The facilities built to support the earliest phase of humanity's space programs, thick-walled, heavily reinforced, designed to handle the stresses of chemical rocketry, endure in fragmentary but identifiable form. There are landmarks that can still be found if you know where to look. Old structures that have survived not because anyone preserved them, but because the physics of their construction gave them a durability that outlasted the civilization that built them. The St. Louis Arch, improbably, is still standing, or enough of it is still standing to be recognizable. The bones of launch facilities, their thick concrete largely intact, though stripped of everything that was once attached to the concrete. And then there is the NASA Launch Tower. It survives in a form that is difficult to approach without a particular quality of attention. Difficult to approach, that is, without feeling the weight of what happened inside it. Because it was here, in a recording made at this specific site before his death, that Victor Aiza spoke the truth that had been buried for most of his adult life. The audio logs he left in the system at this facility document everything: the artifact, the lost days, the encounter with his other self, the warning that was given to him, and the choice he made when he received it. He describes, in his own voice, the reasoning he used to justify proceeding with the Grav Drive development. The utilitarian calculus, the vision of a humanity spread across dozens of worlds, insulated from existential catastrophe by the sheer redundancy of its distribution across space. He also describes the weight of it. Based on what we know of the confession, it seems reasonable to infer that the decision never left him. that watching the evacuation unfold from the position of someone who understood the full chain of causation, who could not share that understanding without dismantling the very effort underway, was its own particular form of isolation. He had become, by the end of his life, a man who had saved humanity and destroyed its home, who understood both of those things clearly, and who appears from everything he left behind to have found no way to resolve the contradiction. Standing near the tower, or in the vicinity of where it is recorded to have stood, since the precise coordinates require the kind of research that most people passing through the Sol system do not undertake. You can see the entire arc of the story compressed into a single view. The structure built to launch humanity's earliest expeditions beyond its own atmosphere, primitive by the standards of the settled systems, but extraordinary in context. And around it, the silence of a dead world, the silence of the home that those first steps eventually cost, and that the man who most clearly understood that cost chose to pay with somebody else's world. There is a particular emotional quality to Earth that does not attach to other ruins in the settled systems, and it is worth trying to characterize it precisely. On other dead worlds, ruins are archaeological, interesting, sometimes poignant, the tangible evidence of lives that ended and the civilizations that enclosed them. On Earth, the ruins are not about strangers. Every person alive in the settled systems traces a biological line back to that specific surface. Every human being carries in their body the evolutionary legacy of a species that emerged on that precise world. Earth is not just the ruins of a civilization, it is the ruins of an origin, and there is a quality to that, to standing on the ground that made you, that is now dead in a way that cannot be undone, that does not have a clean name, but whose emotional signature any person who has stood there recognizes immediately. The grief is not the sharp kind. That kind has been worked through too many times, across too many generations, to remain acute. It has become something older and quieter and more permanent. The kind of grief that is not waiting to be resolved, but has taken up residence as a permanent undertone in the music of a civilization. Always present, never finished. And now, for those who have read Aiza's confession or know its contents, carrying within it something more than grief for an accident, carrying the particular weight that attaches to a loss that was chosen, that was known in advance, that could, conceivably, have been prevented by a single different decision made by a single man with the information to make it. The dead do not stay quiet. Earth is gone, but its absence is among the most active forces in the political and cultural life of the settled systems, still shaping the major institutions and the major conflicts of the present in 2330 with a fidelity that 2 centuries of distance has done very little to diminish. Consider the United Colonies. The UC was founded in 2159 on Earth during the evacuation, established not as the inheritor of a civilization that had already completed its transition, but as the governmental body charged with managing it. It was the institution that coordinated the exodus while the exodus was still happening. What emerged from that experience, the values the UC carried into the settled systems and has never entirely set down, was shaped in the most direct possible way by what the evacuation demanded of it: survival, order, the maintenance of the institutional capacity to make hard collective decisions under pressure, to bear the weight of choices that benefit the group at cost to the individual, to insist on the primacy of the civilization's continuity over the preferences of any given person or community within it. This is not an arbitrary value system. It seems difficult to avoid the inference that it is a direct inheritance of the evacuation experience, the lesson drawn in real time by the people managing the crisis, that uncoordinated individual responses to an event at that scale produce outcomes considerably worse than even imperfect centralized coordination. The UC is the institutional embodiment of that conclusion, still governing by it, still pointing to the history that justified it. New Atlantis is the city that institution built, and the name it carries is worth sitting with for a moment. Whether the choice was deliberate or organic is difficult to confirm at this remove, but the resonance is hard to read as accidental. Atlantis, the mythological lost civilization, the place swallowed by the sea and preserved in cultural memory as the standard against which all subsequent civilizations measure themselves, is a story that has traveled through human culture for millennia. It has never really been about Atlantis. It has always been about loss, and the argument that loss makes, about the idea that there was once something better, something more complete, and that the proper response to its absence is not to accept it, but to try to build its successor. If that reading holds, and one might reasonably infer it was at least part of what the name was meant to carry, then to call your capital city New Atlantis is to declare that you understand yourself as the inheritor of a loss, and that you are committed to the project of answering it, not recovering it. You cannot recover what is genuinely gone, but answering it, building forward from the grief rather than being stopped by it. The Free Star Collective, whose founding philosophy stands in such consistent and fundamental opposition to the UCs, arrived at its values through a different path entirely. In 2167, still within living memory of the evacuation, still inside the long shadow of the crisis that had reshaped everything, a man named Solomon Coe settled the Cheyenne system and founded Aquila City. In 2189, Coe's alliance with the Volier system formalized into the Free Star Collective, a deliberately decentralized libertarian confederation of self-governing colonies dedicated to individual sovereignty and personal freedom. Not a republic with a president, a council of governors, each accountable to their own people first. The Free Star's deep suspicion of centralized authority, its foundational insistence that no institution should accumulate enough power to determine how other people live, was built by settlers who were choosing a different model, not simply reacting against the UCs. That distinction matters, but it is worth holding as a possibility rather than a conclusion that the specific shape of what they were choosing against was informed, at some level, by the evacuation's memory. The decisions made during that crisis about who mattered and who waited had been made by institutions with power, and the first generation to settle the frontier had lived close enough to that history to know how those decisions had gone. Whether or not that connection was explicit in the founding of the Free Star Collective, the values they built feel like they were forged in that knowledge. Both the UC and the Free Star are making arguments, in their political structures and their civic philosophies and their ongoing conflict with each other about what kind of civilization humanity should be building out here among the stars. The UC's argument, survival requires the willingness to subordinate individual preference to institutional capacity. Without the ability to make hard, coordinated decisions at scale, under existential pressure, without that capacity being vested in institutions with the authority to act, the outcome is chaos and preventable death. The evacuation is the evidence. The Free Star's argument, no institution should accumulate enough power to decide whose life is worth saving and how other people should live. Individual sovereignty is not a luxury for stable times. It is the principle that prevents the concentration of authority from becoming the concentration of harm. The right to govern yourself is the first right, and everything that contradicts it requires a stronger justification than any government has yet provided. Both arguments are responses to the same history, even if they arrive at it from different angles. Both are, in their own ways, true. Both are also, in their own ways, incomplete, each one capturing something essential about what the evacuation demonstrated, and each one, in the act of being right about that, being incomplete about the part the other one is right about. The tension between them is not a problem to be solved. It is the ongoing political expression of a civilization still working through the implications of a catastrophe it has never fully processed, playing itself out across light years and generations. So the question returns, not with the same weight it had at the beginning. Something has shifted in the working through of this history, in the following of it, from a man discovering an artifact on Mars to the dead surface of a world and the living cities built in the space its death created. The question was Earth's death a tragedy or a choice someone made for all of us? Both are true. That was also available from the beginning. But the full account of what Aiza knew and when he knew it, and what he chose to do with that knowledge, changes the texture of the both in ways that matter. Victor Aiza is not quite a villain, and the instinct to simply call him one is worth resisting. He was a person who found an ancient object whose nature and origin he did not fully understand, was given knowledge he had no framework to evaluate, was shown a version of the future that included humanity's expansion across the stars, and made a decision that he genuinely believed served the long-term survival and flourishing of the species. His confession, recorded in his own voice in the ruins of the place that had launched humanity's first steps into space, is not the confession of someone who had not thought deeply about the choice he made. It is the confession of someone who had thought about it for decades and had never found a way to be at peace with it. There is something in that which resists simple condemnation, and yet he was warned, he knew, he chose, and then he helped ensure that the people who bore the cost of his choice, the billions who died when Earth finally fell in 2203, the billions more who survived the evacuation into displacement and loss, never had the chance to know who had made the decision that shaped everything about their lives. The truth was buried not to protect them, but to protect the technology, the program, and the people behind it. The concealment was, in that sense, the second choice, and arguably the worse one. Not the decision to proceed, which was at least made in the light of a genuine belief about the greater good. But the decision to deny the people most affected by it the knowledge they would have needed to make their own judgments. The settled systems, 2 centuries later, are built on that concealment. The institutions that govern them, the political conflicts that define them, the civic philosophies that animate them, all of it was constructed by people who did not know what Aiza knew, who mourned Earth as a catastrophe without knowing it was a choice, who built their arguments about power and accountability and the rights of individuals without access to the most relevant data point, that the most consequential decision in human history was made by one person in private, without consultation, and then suppressed. What would the settled systems look like if that truth had been known from the beginning? It is impossible to say. The people who might have made different decisions with that knowledge are gone. The historical window in which a different path might have been taken closed before anyone outside a small circle had the information needed to see it. What remains in the present of 2330 is a civilization living with the consequences of a transaction it mostly doesn't know was made on its behalf. And somewhere in the ruins of the NASA launch tower on a dead planet, the voice of the man who made it, preserved on equipment that had no particular reason to survive, except that the physics of the site happened to be kind to it, explaining himself to a future he knew would eventually come to listen. The stars, he said, were worth it. He believed that. He might have been right. The evidence that humanity survived, that the settled systems are real and inhabited and arguing with each other across dozens of light years, is a form of evidence in his favor. But Earth is still dead, and the people who died on it when the magnetosphere finally failed in 2203 had not been given the opportunity to weigh in on whether the stars were worth it to them. That is the question that does not resolve. Not the historical one, not who knew what when, not the mechanism by which gravity waves from Luna destabilized a planetary magnetic field, not the specific politics of the evacuation. Those questions have answers, or partial answers, that the records can supply. The question that does not resolve is the one that Aiza was living with when he made his recording, and that every person who hears it has to live with afterward. What do you owe the people whose futures you decide for in the dark without asking them? Humanity has been building its answer to that question in the only way civilizations know how, imperfectly, incrementally, through the ongoing friction of people who disagree about what the right answer is and who are willing to argue about it across light years and generations. The UC insists on the necessity of institutions capable of making hard choices. The Free Star insists on the right of individuals and communities to govern themselves without those choices being made for them. Neither position, held alone, is sufficient. Together, in their ongoing unresolved tension, they are perhaps the most honest response a civilization can make to a history as complicated as the one they share. The archive stays open. The stars remember everything.